Hey, everybody, welcome to United Opposition. I'm here today with Mike, and
What's
I'm
up?
and I'm Marshall, and today we're going to talk about Trump and the immigration debate. Hit it. How you doing, Mike? Scott's not with us today.
Yeah, what's up, everybody? I am pumped to be doing this. I was actually really looking forward to this, and I'm glad that it took us a while for you and I to actually do this together because we've gotten to interact and kind of become somewhat friends over the time. And I think it's easier to have these kind of conversations when you're friends than when you don't really know each other, right? Because
Right.
you can agree to disagree and still remain friends.
Right, and that's going to be important as everything in this country continues to unfold, because I think the divisions in our nation are deepening. But what we have to remember is that our next door neighbors aren't really our enemies, even if they vote or think differently from we. I think a lot of people have. Well, I don't want to get into all of that. I'd rather zero in on the topic. But yeah, the bottom line is we do need to kind of come together and find
I
common ground.
think it's important that we can sit at the same table,
Right.
whether we're family or friends or otherwise, because I think reality is, Marshall, most of us, I wouldn't say all of us, but I would say the vast majority of us have more in common and more things we probably agree on than we disagree on.
Right.
Sure, when it comes to political differences, when it comes to even sometimes socioeconomic things, there's differences, but yeah. So I guess today we're talking about the immigration, deportation, judge overstepping, and all of those things. So you go first, Marshall. This is your show.
Well, I don't think the judge overstepped. The judge is perfectly within their rights to issue an order. But so that people understand, over the weekend, the Trump administration deported, I think, in excess of 200 illegal immigrants. Many of them are believed to be criminals or have criminal charges against them or have been convicted. I don't know their legal status entirely, but not all of them, as far as I know. Because not all of them had received due process, which is something that's guaranteed by the 14th Amendment to all persons in America.
To citizens.
No, it's to everyone. It is to everyone. The first portion of the 14th Amendment refers to citizens, but then there is a final clause at the end of the 14th Amendment that says all persons in the country. So that is more broadly defined. And so that means that if you are on our soil, you cannot be punished or prosecuted or expelled without due process, which is why we have due process in the first place for illegal immigrants. So we've always had in our recent history, we didn't way back before we had immigration courts, but ever since we invented the immigration court and tried to kind of control our borders, we have had this due process for immigrants, and that is again under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So, as I understand, Trump sent these planes out to deliver these people, in particular to El Salvador, where they would go into a quite a fine prison complex that is designed to hold the worst of the worst, the gangsters that many of these people are. So they belong there. I think we can come to agreement that these people belong probably in prison. I don't know about all of them, though. I can't say all of them because, again, I don't think they all had due process, but I don't know. But in any case, a judge issued a ruling, a verbal order, that those flights were to be turned around and returned to correct, which is the obvious, in my opinion, violation of their 14th Amendment rights. And the Trump administration said, well, we can't. The planes are in international airspace. We can't recall them, which, as I understand, is absolutely irrelevant. A judge can give an order. It doesn't matter if you are the lowest judge in the land. It doesn't matter if you are a traffic court judge. If you issue an order, even verbally from the bench, it is binding and you must abide by that order until you either get a stay or it's appealed and overturned. So that's my understanding of the situation.
Okay, except for I actually am a little bit pleasantly surprised that we do have somewhat common ground here, Marshall. That we do, that you are at least observing the apparent um, implication that most of these people were likely criminals.
Mhm.
Let me retract that. All of them were criminals because they all were here illegally. So let's take that off the table. But most of them were apparently violent criminals, and I think that
Right.
the bigger thing, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's also important to note the fact you are the company you keep. So even the people that may have not been violent criminals, why are you hanging with violent criminals, right?
Mhm.
I do think that it is, I don't think, I know for a fact, it is the president's priority and prerogative to protect the citizens of this country from known uh, uh, terrorists and attackers.
Mhm.
The president was acting in accordance with the law. He expelled non-citizens based on a 18th century law that hadn't been enacted since World War II, granted, but I don't think there was need or cause for that law, though an argument could be made that it should have been taken advantage of prior to. There wasn't a need or cause as seen by those in power at the time to enact that law. And so President Trump took advantage of a law that, and he acted in accordance with the law. Now, it is not the judge's responsibility or prerogative to enforce the law. That is the responsibility of the executive branch of the government.
Mhm.
The judge had a opportunity to rule on the law, but he was ruling on criminals that were in this country illegally that were now outside of the country, and the judge has no authority outside of this country.
Mhm. Well, again, the judge has authority over the president, who then has authority
That's
outside of the country over American people who are enforcing his orders. You know, the pilots of those planes, for example, are still under presidential authority, in particular when they're in international airspace. So he did this very quickly. He did it basically under the cover of night because he knew that when people found out about this, there would be a case, and it would be brought up before a judge, and a judge would probably say, "Don't do that." And again, everybody's entitled to due process. That's the 14th Amendment. Now, if you're referring to the Alien Enemies Act, the thing is, the Alien Enemies Act only applies in time of war. It was applied in the War of 1812. It was used in World War One, and it was used in World War II. It has not been utilized since. It is a wartime power. It is not a power that can and should be used in peacetime. It has never been used in peacetime. Now, of course, we have a constitutional crisis. We have a judge who has disobeyed. I'm sorry, we have a president who's disobeyed a court order. Not necessarily the first time that's happened in history, by the way, but it's going to become an issue. And we have people who have been expelled from the country without receiving their due process. And there's no way to make those people whole. There's no way to bring them back, give them due process, and then what are we going to do? Turn around and deport them again? But there are also people who have disappeared into the immigration system. There are people who are being held and are, we've got that pro Hamas professor apparently who is in trouble. And we can argue, does he have First Amendment rights and other things and so on? But again, the bottom line is uh, everybody is entitled to due process before our government can put its hands on you and do something to you. You are entitled to due process, and that even applies to people who are present illegally and always has.
okay. So there's a couple of things I want to say. First of all, and I want to give you an opportunity to clarify this. You said that the judges were over the president. That's not, in fact, true. And
No, they're co-equal, but if the judge issues an order, the president has to stop and follow the order until the order is stayed or is overturned on appeal.
Okay. And a argument can be and has been made that the invasion of the United States by millions of illegal immigrants, and I don't think anybody can argue the fact that that has not happened, is an act of war in itself, and these particular people have been labeled as terrorists and enemies of the United States.
Right. So my response to that is you're dealing with nation states. You know, if you're going to talk about war or invasion, wars and invasions are conducted by other nation states. For example, Japan attacking Pearl Harbor was an act of war by Japan. On the other hand, the terrorists attacking us on 9/11 was not an act of war from a legal perspective, simply because they don't have a nation state. Al Qaeda is not a nation, they're a terrorist organization. That doesn't mean we don't go and destroy them and dismantle them. Of course we do. But there is a difference under the law between a nation state and just people who enter the country illegally. You know, so if you establish this precedent that we're going to use military power and military type governance or martial law, perhaps, if you're going to take this very heavy handed militaristic approach to immigrants into this country and to people who have been admitted legally, but we don't like what they say, then you are opening up this Pandora's box where we could end up with a militaristic dictatorship, where you have a president who is very comfortable throwing his power around. That is why Chief Justice Roberts replied to Trump early this morning and said, no, you have to comply, and you do not call for the impeachment of a judge just because the judge disagrees with you. That is entirely inappropriate, especially from a president of the United States. So to me, I found that encouraging. It suggests that maybe the Supreme Court, despite having a 6-3 conservative majority, isn't just going to hack for Trump. And hopefully Trump takes a lesson from that. You know, there's a legal process that's supposed to be followed to protect people's rights. That is something that I think even Scott and I can agree on, because Scott has been always about, you know, he wants the government to stay out, but it should act to protect people's rights. Well, then let the government protect people's rights. Now, he had some comments too, but I'll let you go ahead, Mike, and then.
Okay, so this is about more than just what these people are saying. It's about what these people are doing, right? They're violent criminals that have raped, murdered, and committed other violent crimes, and I'm sure we're going to get in trouble on social media for using those words, but that have committed violent crimes on citizens of the United States. And I think that takes priority and precedent over the rights of people that shouldn't have even been allowed to be here in the first place, and now we're giving them constitutional rights based on something that they should have never had access to begin with.
Yeah, well, even a person who's been sentenced to the death penalty still has constitutional rights. That's why there's an appeals process and so on. And even when a person is deceased, they're dead, but you can't, like, you know, harvest their organs without their permission and things like that. So everybody in this country has rights. That is kind of like one of the bedrock principles of our nation. Now, ain't nobody here is going to shed tears over a murderous or a rapist or a drug trafficker or a human trafficker, these bad hombres, as Trump calls them. The bad hombres do need to be arrested. They do need to be detained. They need to be put in a cage, which is where they belong. And once they've had their due process, and once the due process has said, yes, you're a bad hombre, yes, you do need to go to El Salvador and you need to go live in that cage that they built just for you. I'm all about that. I am 100% in favor of that. My problem is what happens when you've got all the bad hombres out, but now you have this exceptional power that you can use to beat down political opponents and enemies. Let's say, for example, a person who speaks out in support of Hamas, of all things. Not something I would do, but let's say somebody has come out and done that. Okay, well, you have a First Amendment right to express a difference of opinion, even if it's incredibly unpopular. In fact, that's the purpose of the First Amendment, is to protect offensive speech. But here's a person who's done it, and now I don't know if this person is getting their due process. It looks like they should get it, but who knows right now because they're in a black hole. And what's to stop the government from then expanding these powers? Because power consumes more power. Power does not stop. It's like a rock rolling downhill. It does not stop by itself. No authoritarian has ever said, okay, I have enough. You know,
So these people should have never been allowed into this country in the first place.
agree.
Trump didn't send them to prison. He just simply sent them back to where they came from, where they belonged. I don't
Fine.
think we owe anybody that is here on false pretenses that should have never been allowed into the country in the first place. I don't think the intention of the Constitution was to protect the rights of illegal invaders, and that I think that that's what we're kind of arguing about is whether the rights of people that should not even be here at all should they be given rights? I do think that there are basic human rights, right? I don't think that they should necessarily be. Maybe they should be, but that's a whole other argument, a whole other point. Put to death, imprisoned. We didn't do any of that. We simply kicked them out. If someone breaks into your house, first of all, the first thing I'm going to do is probably something much more serious than kicking them out. But at the minimum, I'm going to kick them out. And I don't think that they should be granted any rights to be in my home just because they got in there somehow.
Well, if you agree that all people are entitled to human rights, and there's another document I would bring to your attention called the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And the UNUDHR argues that all people should be entitled, again, to due process. They should have access to courts wherever they may be. And that applies to all humans. That's just a basic document on human rights, which the United States has signed. So I believe, yeah, even if you come here illegally, there is a difference between a person who comes here looking for a better life and they come across the border because they don't want to wait in line. So they're cutting the line. I get it. They're not following the process. It's an illegal act. I get that. But there's still a big difference between that person who just wants to reside here and contribute to our economy and be with their loved ones and practice their faith and their culture and not bother people versus a person who comes here to do drug trafficking and gangster stuff and things like that to actually do violent crimes. There's a big difference between those two people. Even then, even then, I would still argue that even the most violent, loathsome criminal deserves their day in court. And I'm not talking that we have to go through this whole legal proceeding, where they get, a bunch of appeals and everything else. They get due process here and we give them here. Scott says we sent them back to have due process in their own country. We don't know what due process is in other countries. Again, the 14th Amendment says if you are on our soil, you are entitled to due process. Period. That's it. It's done. It's over. The debate has been had. It's been settled. We need to honor the commitment that we've made to all people of the world, not just our citizens.
So at this point, the act is done and over with, and I don't even think that you necessarily disagree that it should have been done. Just that maybe it was against the judge's orders.
Yeah, it was done too quickly. It was done hastily, in a kind of a shady fashion.
I don't think it was even hastily. I think it should have been done 4 years ago. But
well, Biden was quite. Biden and Obama both have exemplary records with expelling people. In fact, Obama was nicknamed the deporter in chief. Just for the record, I'm not a Democrat.
I won't make an argument against Obama was very well known for kicking a lot of people out of the country.
Yeah. I still like Obama, but at the same time, I am opposed to his immigration policy, which I feel lacked compassion. And that's just kind of how things are overall here, regardless of whether they have Democrat or Republican. But again, I'm worried about this next level that we appear to be ratcheting up to under the Trump administration. If the guy had waited a few more weeks, once these people are detained, I think we can wait. We can give them their bread and their water and their due process and then put them on the plane and ship them out. That's just fine. But again, I'm also concerned with the creep of authoritarianism, so.
Okay, so let's go back to the compassion. What did you mean when you said that specifically?
Well, I think we have to treat all humans with a certain standard of respect, even and especially when they don't deserve it, and that means, keeping them safe from self-harm and from the harm of others, providing for their basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, air, water, and providing them with access to the courts and in defense and so on. Just this very basic stuff. I'm not saying that we have to roll out a red carpet and make people feel warm and welcome and cozy here. No, if you've come here especially to do crimes, I don't want you to be comfortable and I don't want you here. But we are going to detain you, and while you're detained, you're going to have certain rights that are allowed to you, which I think is reasonable because we can't treat people like animals, even if they want to be animals, even if
But
they
I
act
don't I
like
don't think
animals.
anyone was treated like an animal. To be clear
Okay.
about that. They were
Okay.
they were kicked out of a place that they didn't belong. They were kicked
Right.
out of a place they had no right to be.
All right. So yeah, and I can't speak to the details of their treatment. I know that there was video filmed and everything, and it's showing people shackled. I think people can throw some shade on that, but does that constitute a violation of their rights, or is that treating them as animals? I don't know. We put criminals' mugshots on the news and stuff all the time. Again, I'm not going to shed a lot of tears over the specific individuals
Okay.
that were deported. My concern is, again, if that authoritarian creep begins to take root,
But
and
you say
you know
authoritarian creep, but isn't it the executive branches, and especially most of which is in the president? Isn't it their responsibility to take care of our country? And didn't they act in the best interest of our country by kicking them out of our country?
be acting in a manner that is clearly unconstitutional is in no way in the best interest of our country, nor is disobeying a constitutionally appointed judge. And we can look at a whole host of other actions and judicial rulings that have come out in the past couple weeks that clearly indicate that the Trump administration is not behaving in a manner that is considered constitutional. Now, the verdict's out. These cases are going to be appealed to the Supreme Court, but he is moving so fast and doing so many things so quickly. His supporters think it's great. I'm sure you think it's great, all these things he's doing, but there are legitimate constitutional concerns. And here's the deal, right? We can cheer President Trump because he's doing what he said he was going to do. He's obviously flexing his power and he's doing it to some good effect, right? The immigrants are not coming in, the immigrants are being expelled. He's cracking down on government waste and programs, at least allegedly, and so on. He's doing all of this stuff. Well, it was, Scott. It's the 14th Amendment. You got to read the 14th Amendment, especially the last line. All right, back on track here. But what happens when Trump is replaced? When somebody comes behind him? What if that person is not Trump? What if that person is a hardcore leftist? What if this country swings hard to the left? I don't even know if we're going to have another election, frankly, but let's say we do, and let's say, or whatever happens, let's say we just swing hard to the left. Now you have a leftist in there who says, you know what, we're going to open the floodgates, we're going to balloon the government, we're going to do all of this stuff, and I've got my handy executive order pin, and I'm doing those things that Trump established a precedent for me to do. I'm going to ignore judges and other things because Trump established the precedent. And that's why I think we all need to be concerned. We need, our president is not a king. The president only has permission to do what Congress empowers him to do. And if the president decides to overstep those bounds and the court says, no, 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 you're crossing the line, the president needs to respect that boundary and step back across it. Because if he doesn't, he sets a precedent where what happens when the next president who you don't like steps across it without consequences? You're not going to like that.
Well, they did it for a long time. We had 4 years of that, and then prior to that, 4 years of rule of law, and then 8 years of that prior to Trump.
Oh, okay. So, what is something that one of these prior presidents did that the courts ruled they can't do, but they did it anyway?
The forgiveness of student debt. Let's start with that one.
Okay. Did the student debt get forgiven?
I think that they attempted to do it, and it got overridden.
So the system worked. Now, it would be better if nobody tried to step their foot over the line, but they did, and the courts ruled. Now, I have my opinions on the whole student debt thing, but fine. I get that the courts ruled, and if, as far as I know, the Department of Education and the Biden administration followed the court orders. The student debt was not ultimately forgiven. So I expect that presidents are going to test boundaries because that's what they're going to do when they want to implement their agenda. But when the courts say no, I expect them to stop, even if I disagree with the court. Because what's more important is corralling the executive authority in this country, because that's how you protect the individual rights of all people. Right now, it's bad hombres. None of us really care about them. But again, we've seen countless times throughout history that power is never satisfied and it always grows and expands. It creeps, authoritarian creep. And eventually, maybe one of us is considered a bad hombre. Maybe I'm considered a bad hombre because I'm a leftist. Or maybe you're considered the bad hombre because you were a known Trump supporter. What then? So.
Okay, so Scott's asking, should Lincoln have attempted the Emancipation Proclamation? Was that constitutional?
The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to any of the areas under U.S. control. So it was sort of an act that was only intended to apply to those places that were in rebellion against the United States. It did not free any slaves in and of itself, not when it was issued, because obviously the Confederacy is not going to obey Lincoln's proclamation.
The U.S. never recognized
Slavery,
the Confederacy is not a part of the U.S. The
correct.
Confederacy recognize themselves as not a part of the U.S.
Right, but the U.S. did recognize they were in rebellion, and that is to whom it applied. Slavery was outlawed by the amendments to the Constitution. It was not outlawed by the Emancipation Proclamation. So, and the Emancipation Proclamation was never challenged in court. So,
Well, and I don't think it should have been, but
yeah, of course.
I'm not arguing for the Emancipation Proclamation. I think the point is in the principle, not in the act itself, right? But
right, it was a political act that he did to galvanize support at a time when the Union kept losing battles, and then they finally won the Battle of Gettysburg, and that was kind of the turning point of the war. But that's the history of it.
okay, so I think the biggest debate can be had over whether we were in a position or time of war or not, because based on the law that the administration used to deport these criminals.
Right. Well, we can't be at war against illegal immigrants. Okay, we can be at war against an invading army sent by another nation state. That's what you can declare war on another. So if I can point at Venezuela or Russia or China or North Korea and say, we're declaring war on you because you sent an invading force here, that's one thing. But outside of that, no, it is not my belief that that act applies as a peacetime presidential power. Remember, that act was used to justify Japanese internment during World War II. And I think I would be hard pressed to find anybody today who thinks that was a good use of that act. It wasn't,
Agreed.
And so maybe we shouldn't be regarding it with such fondness. Scott said something. He said that the same arguments being used against Trump were used against Lincoln. Lincoln did. He suspended, for example, habeas corpus, which again is unconstitutional. It's a violation of the Constitution. So Lincoln also, broke some laws. But again, the difference is he was not smacked down for it. The judicial branch just kind of let it go. Does that make it right? No, absolutely not. He should not have suspended the writ of habeas corpus and arrested people like journalists for sharing their opinion. He should not have done those things. Lincoln is a great president, but he is not all holy or impeccable. He was still a human, you know. So that's
But
my
there,
take on that.
I don't believe that there was a whole bunch of activist judges running across the country at that time either. So
Well, I don't know what you mean by an activist judge. There are judges who have political leanings and biases, I would say, because we're human. But remember, our court system is layered and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And you guys are holding the 6-3 majority. So if we're going to worry about judicial activism, I have more to worry about than you do. So I wouldn't worry about this lower court. Again, Trump should not have worried about it. He should have either waited for a stay of the order or have the order overturned on an appeal, and everything would have been fine. But he
but
didn't do
but I
that.
also
He
don't
ignored the
believe
order.
an activist judge should be allowed to override the authority of the president.
Well, how do you prove that a person is an activist judge though? Because that's a judge's job. A
Well,
judge's job is to
you're
say
more
to the
concerned about
executive
the
branch,
rights
no,
of
that's a
criminals,
step too far.
when you're more concerned about the rights of criminals than you are of the citizens, then I think that would be a fair label to place on someone.
Yeah, I don't think that's the case at all. In what way was this judge more concerned with the rights of criminals over citizens? These are people who are detained. They're not mixing with the citizenry. They're detained, awaiting deportation following their day in court. There's no conflict here, and I think a judge should be equally concerned with the rights of citizens as well as the rights of people we've detained, whether they're citizens or not. If they're on our soil, a judge should be concerned with their rights.
Okay, so Scott's asking, and I'm gonna comment on this before, but I want to have Marshall comment on this. Yeah, how do we determine that a president is a dictator? And I don't actually believe, unless you tell me that I'm wrong and you say otherwise, I don't actually believe that Marshall called President Trump a dictator. But I think Marshall was saying that he's concerned about authoritarian slip, and I think that your concern is more about what's in the future than it is even what's current and even this existing president right now.
Correct. Yeah, as I've said to people, in a way, Trump is kind of Caesar, but then they killed Caesar, and then we had Augustus, and Augustus was kind of okay actually. But then after Augustus, you get this guy who's named Tiberius, and Tiberius was a purging, murdering guy. You know, and then of course you get Caligula after Tiberius, who was infamous. Later you get Nero, and so you have these swings where you might have a good, decent emperor, and then you have somebody who's entirely deranged. But because there is no check on their power, they're able to carry out their deranged fantasies on the people around them. And we don't want that. That's why we have a Bill of Rights.
So I want to I know we probably should be wrapping up here. I want to say that first of all, I enjoyed the conversation with you, Marshall. I respect you as a human, and I think we've come to at least start to become friends over the past year. I think that it's important. This show exists for a reason, and it's important that we are able to have conversations where each side can start to see the premise and understand where the other side is coming from, and maybe not at the end of the day completely agree, but at least concede, okay, well, maybe there is a valid point there, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the things you said is you acknowledged my humanity, and I want to acknowledge yours as well. And that's really important. We have to recognize that the other side is not just a bunch of mindless, goose stepping, you know, uh, Nazis or whatever, right? That's not what you guys are. You
Right.
guys are human beings. You have feelings. Prick us, do we not bleed? Tickle us, do we not laugh? Right? It's all of that, right? And we have to understand that the other side's human too, and that we want, by and large, very much the same things. We want our basic needs met. We want opportunities. We love our families. We want warmth and goodness in society. want for the law to be upheld. We want order. We want progress. We want prosperity, and so on. We all want the same things. We just disagree on the best path to get there. But by having this conversation, maybe we can find a third way, that's not, radical left socialism or far right authoritarianism. Maybe we can find a middle ground, and get there together. And that's the goal.
Yep, that's right. So I want to thank you guys for watching. Scott, we're looking forward to you coming back. Miss you, brother. And Marshall, again, I'll repeat this again. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you, Mike. I had a great show with you, and I hope we can do it again.
That's right. Absolutely.
All right, everybody. Well, this has been United Opposition with Mike and Marshall and Scott in the comments. And those of you, Brett, out there on the comments, I want to say thank you for speaking up, Brett, and sharing your thoughts. And all of you who watch this, continue to tune in and share your thoughts and ideas with us, even afterwards, because we go back and see those comments. So thank you all. This has been United Opposition, and we'll see you in a week.
Bye.